on a book from a few years ago on the history of tourism in Nepal. And it's going to be much more along the popular culture lines than some kind of erudite scholarship. So I hope that's okay. But in that tone, I want to start with a question. Has anyone here seen the 2016 film Doctor Strange? A few? Can't admit it. Okay. A couple of you. Well, this was a Hollywood film rendition of a of a Marvel Comics book series from the 1960s, and the film is set mainly in London, Hong Kong, and New York, where it's the standard forces of good and evil fighting for intergalactic supremacy. But important parts of the film are set in Kathmandu, and there the film's hero, Dr. Stephen Strange, who is actually played by your own Benedict Cumberbatch, adopting an American accent. Dr. Strange is a medical doctor who's been in a terrible accident, and his hands have been destroyed, and he goes to Kathmandu to encounter a spiritual figure called the Ancient One, who's played by another Briton, Tilda Swinton. And there, with the help of the Ancient One, Dr. Strange is both cured but also miraculously empowered to become a superhero. Interestingly, as I said, some parts of the film are actually filmed in Kathmandu, but also a lot of the Kathmandu scenes were actually on an elaborately constructed London soundstage where they meticulously recreated the Tamil neighborhood of Kathmandu, where some of you may have visited, the tourist district. And they brought in Nepali extras from London who could stand around talking Nepali, and fog machines and the whole works. But the point is that in the film, Kathmandu stands as the kind of mystical navel of the universe. It's where the forces of occult magic congeal and become empowering for the hero. And so with this occult plot line, it's not surprising that the film is chock full of almost every Orientalist stereotype you could imagine. And so when a student of mine sent me a copy of an interview that Benedict Cumberbatch had given to the press about his experiences in Nepal, I expected him to have a kind of basic critical consciousness about some of the myths that his film was trafficking, but that was not the case. In fact, Cumberbatch found Kathmandu to be exotic and, quote, incredibly spiritual and marvelous. In the same interview, the film's director goes on to say, quote, "I've been all over the world, but there's no place on the planet like Kathmandu. It is a city with almost no Western influence in it. It is a large city that is so deeply mystical and religious in all operations and in a most peaceful, beautiful, and colorful way." And it keeps going like that.
That's the director, or that's Benedict Cumberbatch?
That's the film's director, part of the same interview. Now, my guess is that those of you who have visited Kathmandu probably did not, well, I don't know, maybe you did find it an incredibly spiritual and marvelous place. But a place with almost no Western influence, deeply mystical and religious, a peaceful city. How anyone could go to Kathmandu and not find, among other things, a chaotic, crowded, underdeveloped, noisy city is difficult to understand. And of course, Kathmandu has its many charms, and Nepalis are wonderful and gracious people. But how is it that presumably reasonable people like Benedict Cumberbatch can go to Nepal and find a place that arguably doesn't exist outside of their own imagination? That is the question, broadly construed, that I tried to answer in my recent book on the history of tourism in Nepal. After a lifetime of hearing comments like these, and I'm sure many of you have heard the same comments, I wanted to know how and why Westerners have constructed not just an imagined Kathmandu, but an imagined Himalayan region that is marked by this mystical alterity. As I dug deeper into these questions, I soon found that the kinds of things that Cumberbatch was saying were anything but new. In fact, for most of the last 200 years, Europeans and Americans have been imagining the Himalayas as a magical, mystical place. And I would say especially for countercultural types. You know, people who are unhappy with the secular, rational, capitalist West, for them, the Himalayas were the last unknown place, and therefore the last place on which they could project their hopes and dreams and fantasies. The irony is that I could read you quotations from people in almost every generation over the last century and a half, and they would be almost identical with what Cumberbatch had to say. People have been saying the same things for a very long time, and even to this day, in an undiminished way, the West has looked to the Himalayas for what it imagines it has lost. So what I try to do in my book is to explain how and why these fantasies originated, or explore those things, how they then materialized in various forms of tourism, mainly focusing on Nepal after 1950, and then how Nepalis learned to, in effect, sell the dreams that tourists brought with them to Nepal. Certainly there's no inherent quality in the Himalayas that make them an exotic and magically alluring place. I think people living in these zones don't experience them that way. Rather, it's outsiders whose mental maps have turned the Himalayas into this liminal borderland. And as an imagined in-between space, the Himalayas exert a strong pull on the imaginations of explorers, scholars, tourists, mountaineers, and others, even if that peripherality is mainly the product of their own cultural and political imaginations. So my book was, as I said, an effort to try to figure out these things and answer questions for myself. And what I've tried to show is that to the extent that it is outsiders who have structured their ideas and their imaginations in such a way as to find the Himalayas to be incredibly spiritual and marvelous, then it's not surprising that what outsiders have found in places like Nepal and probably Tibet has more to do with where they came from than where they went to. So time and time again, outsiders have used the Himalayas as a land in which to find that which they imagine to have lost in the core zones, but which they hope still lives on in some mysterious margins between known worlds. So the Himalayas in particular seem to have a long history of being a locus of projections of longing for the lost. And so I've tried to organize this talk around a number of what I'm calling missing links. And to begin, although my main focus is in my work has been on Western imaginings of the Himalayas, I think it's also worth noting that South Asians also have fantasized about the Himalayas as a kind of mystical borderland. From Vedic references to the Himalayas as the abode of the gods, to repeated associations between gods and mountain locations in the Mahabharata, in the Ramayana, these lofty and remote Himalayan zones have long served the South Asian imagination as a kind of bridge between heaven and earth. From Hindu mythology to Hindi films, the Himalayas are imagined as a region of both extreme renunciation, so think rishis, sadhus, and other ascetics, but also extreme indulgence, like in Shiva and Parvati's erotic play. And as such, the Himalayas, I think, remain a land of anti-structural projection and also erotic fantasy for a lot of South Asians even to this day. Consider how in many Hindi films, the courtship scenes or the love song dance sequences are often set in a Himalayan meadow. And also even now, people go to the mountains for honeymoons. They still have this erotic charge. But turning our attention back to the colonial era, I think the British also understood the Himalayas, and especially perhaps Nepal after 1816, as a kind of buffer zone between themselves and other geopolitical powers, first the Chinese and later the Russians. That Nepal remained a quasi-independent state throughout the Raj is, I would say, the result of British geopolitical strategizing, not some quality that was inherent in the region or its people. Here, the British indulged their Nepali Rana underlings, the Rana family that ruled Nepal for a century between roughly 1850 and 1950. The British indulged the Ranas in their kind of xenophobic kleptocracy to the extent that Rana policies were also in the interests of the British. Rana xenophobia ensured that Nepal was, if not a no man's land, then at least a no white man's land for a long time. And Rana kleptocracy ensured that a steady supply of poor military recruits and other labor migrants flowed across the borders throughout the colonial period. That Nepal exists today as a nation state and not a former princely state of India is arguably an artifact of Nepal's historical constitution as this colonial geopolitical borderland. One of the results of this British policy is that when European Indologists discovered Nepal in the 19th century, in a way Nepal was already, it seems to be, imagined as a borderland between two already existing zones of political and cultural coherence, India on the one hand and China, Tibet on the other. It was in this magical, forbidden land where time stood still in Nepal that European Indologists recreated, in a way, the Himalayas as a kind of time-warped cultural interface. With Rana isolationism fueling the myth of Nepali timelessness, Indologists imagined that Nepal to be a kind of enchanted borderland where might be found clues to an ancient Indic past, the glory days before racial decline and Muslim conquests had, as Europeans imagined, reduced South Asians to a pitiful state fit only for colonial rule. Similarly, Indologists constructed Nepal as the last refuge of a kind of primeval Buddhism, now lost in its homeland to the south, but also, of course, corrupted in the form of popish Lamaism to the north. In other words, for European Indologists, the borderland interface of Nepal was the imagined missing link between a glorious Indic past and its degenerate present, a place where what had been lost in India could still be found. And then in the 19th century, European and American theosophists took these colonial fantasies of the Himalayas to their logical or illogical extremes. While Indologists looked for ancient manuscripts in Kathmandu, the founder of Theosophy, who some of you may be familiar with, Madame Blavatsky, she had a much more convenient system in place. Rather than traveling to Asia, Madame Blavatsky would simply open a drawer in her cupboard periodically where she found mystical handwritten rice paper messages that were sent to her by the so-called Himalayan Mahatmas, the so-called masters of the universe. Again, it sounds like something out of Marvel Comics. Or also she referred to them as the Tibetan Brotherhood that she claimed resided as immortals in the vastness of the Himalayas. So with Tibet essentially the last remaining, most isolated, most distant terra incognita on the face of the earth by the end of the 19th century, Tibet also became the last blank screen on which to project Western dreams and fantasies. And so as such, over time, Madame Blavatsky's claims become more and more unverifiable, incontestable, and far-fetched in every sense of the word. By the turn of the 20th century, Theosophy had emerged as one of Euro-America's leading countercultural movements. And I think a good case can be made that it's Theosophy that is largely responsible for focusing the West's popular longing for occult and hidden meaning onto the Himalayan region. In Theosophical thought, the Himalayas came to occupy the kind of geo-spiritual place of privilege that I think it retains even to this day in a lot of the West's, in some versions of Western popular imagination. Intriguingly, among Blavatsky's imagined Himalayan Mahatmas, only 2 were actually Tibetan or even South Asian. The rest, in tune with Victorian race theory, the rest were white Aryan masters that she claimed were preserving in their mountain hideouts the once and future wisdom of the superior Aryan or Western race. For our purposes, the point is that in the face of extreme alienation and disenchantment brought about by rapid industrial modernization and militarization in the West in the early 20th century, Blavatsky and Theosophy imagined the Himalayas to be this last bastion of uncorrupted Aryan wisdom. So once again, the Himalayas serve as a home of a kind of missing link, now between nothing less than the glories of an ancient Aryan past, on the one hand, and the future well-being of humanity, waiting to be led back to the truth by the great White Brotherhood, which she also claims resides in the Himalayas as astral spirits. Any of you who are familiar with James Hilton's best-selling 1933 novel Lost Horizon will immediately recognize its resonances with theosophical ideas and especially of the Himalayas as this land containing a precious time capsule that will restore Western civilization. Written during the post-World War I period of extreme anti-modernist disillusionment and countercultural angst, published during the Great Depression, and influenced by decades of theosophically oriented fantasies about Tibet, Lost Horizon was an instant sensation. Like Blavatsky's Tibet, James Hilton's utopic lamasery of Shangri-La is both Buddhist and Christian. Its libraries preserving all the great works of mainly Western civilization against an impending global calamity, and its High Lama is, it turns out, a Catholic priest from Luxembourg. But snug in his magical Himalayan valley, where time is mysteriously slowed, the High Lama explains, and I quote, "Here we shall stay with our books and our music and our meditations, conserving all the frail elegancies of a dying age, and seeking such wisdom as men will need when their warring passions are spent. We, that is Westerners, have a heritage to cherish and bequeath." So Western heritage is being preserved in the Himalayas. Once again, Tibet is home to what the West imagines it has lost, a missing link to its own past and future, frozen in the glacial timelessness of the Himalayas. And here, just as an aside, it's interesting that, to go back to where I started with Dr. Strange, in effect, the narrative features of Dr. Strange owe a great deal to Hilton, who owes a great deal to Blavatsky, and the themes keep continuing in every generation. The ancient one is the High Lama. The hero, Cumberbatch, is a version of Hugh Conway in Lost Horizon, and so on. So with so many other missing links thought to be hidden in the Himalayas, it was inevitable perhaps that Westerners would imagine the ultimate missing link to be lurking in the remote high Himalayan zones of Nepal and Tibet. This is, of course, the Yeti. The missing link that would tie mankind to its own evolutionary past. In the book, I document how during the 1950s, which was a decade when the West was obsessed with monsters and UFOs and paranormal phenomenon of all kinds, in the 50s, one of the most colorful fantasies was the abominable snowman. We forget this, but after the Himalayan Yeti first entered the Western imagination following the British mountaineering expeditions of the 1920s, it wasn't until the 1950s that Yeti mania really struck, and it's difficult to even imagine this, but the fact is that for most of the decades, every year there were literally dozens of high-profile expeditions into the Himalayan backcountry. Yeti hunters, of course, inevitably returned empty-handed, but that did not stop Yetis from making many appearances in popular films and comic books, usually as villains, but occasionally as heroes, where they often made appearances alongside aliens, spies, communists, and other frightening creatures from the 1950s. And here, if I may, I think it's interesting to note that right now we seem to be in the middle of a kind of Yeti film renaissance. I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but last year we had Smallfoot, which was set in the Himalayas among Yetis. Now playing is Missing Link, no less. And I'm informed that there are trailers out for yet another one later this year. So I'm not sure what this means that Yetis have gone from bloodthirsty, sex-crazed fiends in the 50s to these lovable creatures for children today, although I think I have some theories. But in fact, even this lovable terrain is something that was already explored back in the early 60s with the release of Bugs Bunny and the Abominable Snow Rabbit, which I'm not kidding, I would recommend that you Google this and you can watch it on YouTube after I'm done. So obviously the Yeti has a strange and complicated pedigree in the Western imagination. As we've seen, Tibet and the Himalayas were imagined as the last home and holdout of things lost in the civilized Western world, whether it's spirituality, esoteric wisdom, or a life not tainted by capitalist modernity. And I think the Yeti is part of this tradition of fantasy projection, whereby people wanted to believe that something could still exist in the the least known part of the earth. As for Nepalis, most Nepalis neither knew nor cared about Yetis, but Westerners deeply desired their existence. Once again, the mysterious Himalayan borderlands become a repository for a part of the Western self that it imagines it is lost. That Western popular films, novels, and comic books often depicted Yetis as cavorting with Chinese communists points to another important geopolitical development for Nepal and, of course, Tibet in the 1950s, namely its reemergence as a frontline state. As in previous versions of the Great Game, though now with the United States replacing Britain as global hegemon, again in the 1950s, Nepal's fame suddenly rebounded as it was reconstituted in the Western imagination as a bulwark against advancing communism. So the Soviet Union, China, India, and the United States all courted Nepal for its affections, lavishing gifts on Nepal's King Mahendra to the extent that Mahendra could nix Nepal's democratic experiment and set himself up as panchayat dictator. In an interview published in Time magazine in 1960, King Mahendra justified his royal coup d'etat, claiming that, quote, "The elected government was always trying to put me in an awkward position," unquote. And as for popular parliamentary plans that threaten to impose property taxes on Nepali elites, Time quotes Mahendra as asking, quote, "Why should we pay taxes when we can always get more money from the Americans?" unquote. And of course, Mahendra had an excellent point. And by the early 1960s, Nepal was, in the words of one foreign expert, quote, "being smothered in foreign aid." So with the US bankrolling Nepal's state apparatus, why should the king risk alienating his main power base by imposing taxes? For their part, the United States supported Mahendra's coup, reasoning, quote, that any anti-communist government is a good government. for my purposes here, the point is that Nepal rose to unprecedented levels of international attention in the context of its rebirth as a geopolitical buffer state or borderland between great powers. And just to underline that point, I think it's noteworthy that there were more headlined news articles on Nepal in the American news magazines Time and Newsweek between 1950 and 1960 than in all other decades combined. It's also intriguing to note that once the 14th Dalai Lama fled across the Himalayas to India in 1959, and once Mahendra had made Nepal a relatively secure, somewhat American client state in 1960, a couple things suddenly ceased. One was first world press coverage of Nepal. After 1960, Nepal was quickly recast from the role of relevant political actor to exotic curiosity. The other sudden change was the almost overnight abandonment of the big internationally funded Yeti hunts that had culminated in 1959 and 60. In that one season alone, there were 11 high-profile expeditions. Those all stopped. And given that both Russians and Chinese consistently charged that Himalayan Yeti hunting and mountaineering were fronts for anti-communist spy activities, it's fascinating to note how the West lost interest in both Nepal and in its Yetis. At the moment when Nepal stopped being a geopolitical player, and when the Dalai Lama had escaped, and when that escape diffused some of the West's anxieties over the fate of Tibet, suddenly Yeti expeditions stopped and Nepal drops out of the world news. My point is simply that the power of the borderland myth rises and falls as powers external to Nepal need such a borderland for their own imaginative and political purposes. Since the 1960s, Nepal's emergence as an international tourist destination has had a lot to do with the region's ongoing role as an imagined mystical borderland. As the Himalayas increasingly lost their relevance as a Cold War buffer zone, another wave of countercultural angst swept the West, reviving earlier images of Tibet and Nepal as a liminal zone imbued with spiritual qualities. The 1960s and 70s, of course, saw Nepal inundated with Western youth, intent on what one scholar has called imaginative escape, many of them toting books by earlier generations of people that had fantasized about the Himalayas, including Theosophists. Today, many of these have embraced many tourists have embraced the Nepal state's rebranding of its tourist product as an adventure destination. But even now, most tourists in surveys report that religion is one of Nepal's primary cultural attractions, and a sizable portion of those tourists are explicitly dharma tourists. Here, the old constructions of Nepal as a zone of Hindu-Buddhist interface are reborn, making Nepal perhaps unique as a kind of one-stop shopping destination for exotic Eastern religions, including perhaps the most desired form of Eastern exoticism today, Tibetan Buddhism, among a certain set. In fact, one can, and I have tried to in my book, trace Tibetan Buddhism's desperate exile's embrace of Westerners to the Kathmandu tourist encounter in the 1960s, and I can talk more about that. Not unlike the Theosophists who imagine the Himalayas to be harboring the hope of the West's spiritual renewal, today's Dharma tourists are typically first-worlders drawn to Nepal by dreams of therapeutic restoration. At least since the Theosophist Carl Jung's so-called psychologization of Tibetan Buddhism in the 1930s, Western countercultural belief has often looked to the East for treatment of the ills that have befallen Western industrial civilization. If Eastern religion is really psychology, as Jung claimed, then Eastern religious practices, most notably meditation, can be reimagined as, quote, techniques for the attainment of mental health, or in other words, psych. Jung was the first and most important of a long line of quasi-scientific figures to turn the East into a therapy, with results ranging from the modern figure of the Guru Rinpoche as therapist, to meditation and yoga as self-help, self-discovery, and even fitness phenomenon. Cut loose from their epistemological moorings, so-called Eastern ideas and practices are harnessed to this ever-shifting Western spiritual malaise, once again transforming the East into this screen for Western projections. How else to account for the strange irony of today's Western Dharma tourists in Nepal, who are typically people seeking Western-style self-improvement in Buddhist teachings and practices that in a way deny the very existence of the self that they look to be restoring. The contemporary Irish poet Cathal O'Sherky has a poem entitled Kathmandu, and the very first line of this poem is this: Kathmandu is there to change you. Kathmandu is there to change you. For O'Sherky, Kathmandu is apparently not there to serve as a place for Nepalis to live. It is there to change you. You being Westerners, whatever. Like O'Sherky, countless Westerners have been drawn to the Himalayan periphery less to find the people who live there than to find the selves that they wish to be. Kathmandu exists in this logic to provide Westerners with the missing link between their own alienation and their own self-discovery. So to conclude, it strikes me that foreigners have been losing the strangest things in the Himalayas, or at least looking for them for a very long time. In this talk, I have not talked about the lost years of Jesus. I have not talked about the lost years of Sherlock Holmes. Yet inevitably, of course, these were in the Himalayas. I haven't talked about the lost world of Shambhala, the lost heroes of Everest. It goes on and on. But my main point is to argue that the Himalayas, for whatever it might be geophysically, the Himalaya is a region heavily loaded with imaginative projections of external powers that are largely responsible for its production and maintenance as this peripheral border zone. All powers need peripheries, and borderlands between them are inevitably then regions of anxiety and danger on the one hand, and enchantment and longing on the other. If, as Tuan Yifu argues, peripheral location is a geographical emblem of anti-structure, then those most heavily invested in anti-structural, countercultural causes will be attracted to the most peripheral geographic locations. Not surprisingly then, people on the countercultural fringes of power conflate their own experiences of marginality with the imagined marginality of the Himalayas. As a result, a region like the Himalaya is transformed into, to quote one scholar, a vessel for contents defined by alien scopes and concerns, or to quote the Tibetan scholar Jamyang Norbu, quote, the region and people come across merely as the setting for the personal dramas of white people. The underlying premise is that the Himalayan region is only relevant if it serves the needs of the West, unquote. And with that, I will stop. And I'd be happy to take questions or comments.
Mark, a couple of quick points. It would be wrong, not that I'm any great defender of the Ranas, but it would be wrong to attribute the whole business of recruitment in the foreign armies to the Ranas. I would say that they've only directly supported us and allowed it for 70 years of the last 205 years of Gurkha recruitment to the British Crown. The first lorries were fighting for Ranjit Singh in Afghanistan.
Mhm. But the Laoris, even with Ranjit Singh, they didn't go, there were push factors that were compelling them to leave, high taxation and other things. And the Ranas, I appreciate your point. It's not a simple one, but still I think that the conditions of poverty in the hills that were not ameliorated by the Ranas contributed to the push factors that drove people across the borders into the recruiting zones.
Point for later. I mean, Jung Bahadur and his immediate successors went to enormous lengths to stop us recruiting anybody, which is why for the first 30 years
For 30 years.
of Rana rule,
Right,
it had to be done clandestinely.
right. But then it opens up significantly after 1885.
Yeah, only because we got our Maharaja in position who owed everything to us, and we said, not only are you going to allow us to recruit them, you are going to recruit for us.
Right. In other words, you're saying that
No, I'm just correcting you on a simple
that
point of
right
attributing it all to the Ranas.
the Rana Maharaja was a British plant, which in a way, yeah, I would buy that.
Yeah, sorry, you're widening my question. It was just a simple point of attributing it all to the Ranas. On the tourist thing, I find myself thinking. I mean, definitely there was a lot of tourists who were dharma from the outset, but there's hundreds and thousands of people who go to Nepal who don't even think about that. They're out there for adventure, for sort of seeing the Himalayas, for enjoying somewhere you can go and see 2 miles of the Earth's surface sticking up in front of you, and the whole business of getting away from the West in order to, Jimmy Roberts, the man who started the whole trekking phenomenon, he didn't think about that at all. He started it because on a way to a mountaineering expedition, he suddenly said, people might want to just do this, not climb the hill, just do this. And he's the chap who invented the word trekking.
Actually, he didn't.
Well, he used trekking.
Sure, he did.
He used trekking.
But people were using the word trekking in Nepal before Jimmy Roberts showed up.
Yeah. Doesn't stop my point. He was the main guy who got the whole operation going.
Although people were trekking in Nepal before Jimmy Roberts.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm challenging you then. What percentage, I mean, you're this all-embracing tourism, what percentage of people are influenced by this dharma, this religious experience? Because there's large numbers who fly in every day who have no knowledge of that at all.
There have been Nepali scholars who have done survey research on this, and I don't have the figures in front of me, but sizable majorities cite as one of the primary attractions of Nepal its religious aura. And yes, they're coming to Nepal also to go trekking, but I think that part of Nepal's attraction, and part of it's almost, the amount of kind of goodwill that the West has for Nepal is something that can't be explained just by mountains. There's something deeper going on, and what I've tried to suggest here in my book is that what that deeper part of what's going on is that there's this long history of a kind of imagined place that continues to draw people. Okay.
I have a suggestion that you mentioned that Tibet is before 1959 is an extremely isolated sort of society, right? But when I look at not necessarily, when I look at other set of Tibet as from since the 7th, 8th century, we have a very extreme close cultural connection. People visit India, Nepal so often. Then later 12th, we have a very close connection with the Mongols and Yuan dynasty. Then Manchus, even Manchu capitalists to this region have a lot of Tibetan lamas visiting almost every year, different rituals. Then we have a couple of wars with the Gorkhas. And to this Bhutan, lots of Tibetans come back and forth. Bhutan is a ritual pilgrimage. And Darjeeling, Sikkim, there is a permanent Tibetan market. Tibetans are coming across the border almost every day to sell in the Tibetan butter and cheese, buying salt, everything. It's not necessarily very isolated and close to country. That's kind of a different perception. What people think is a totally locked up country. No one knows. But we have a really kind of in terms of cultural, religious, or business, we have quite good connection with all neighbor countries.
I agree entirely, and what I was trying to suggest is that Westerners imagined Tibet to be isolated and closed, partly because it was geographically remote, partly because it was relatively difficult to get there. But no, I don't mean to imply that it was. I'm just saying that this is part of the mental construction, and because it was relatively unknown, it could become a place of imagined projection. That was my point.
Okay.
So, but absolutely, I agree. And the same kinds of points have been made about Nepal, that it was timeless, unchanging, and I have personally tried to challenge those kinds of myths as well. Yes?
Thank you for this very inspiring talk, and I think it's very interesting because most of the points you make for the kind of imagination of Nepal could or have been made partly for Tibet. And why is it that other areas like maybe whatever in Pakistan or whatever, even Bhutan maybe, or Arunachal Pradesh or whatever, never developed this kind of attraction?
You know, and again, I want to emphasize that I think my theory is that Theosophy had a lot to do with this, and Madame Blavatsky is a fascinating character. Her interest in the occult begins with, like many other European occultists at the time, with a focus on Egypt. So the cults of ancient Egypt and esoterica. But then, as Egypt became more and more known and effectively and colonized, it became less conducive to the kinds of, if I may, outrageous claims that Madame Blavatsky needed to make, and she literally had to look for somewhere else where she could make claims that could not be contested. And first she goes to India, and she tries to become a Buddhist, and is met with resistance. And eventually, well, she claims to have visited Tibet. There's no reason to believe that she ever did. But nevertheless, conveniently, she can communicate with Tibetan astral spirits through these rice paper missives. And so I think that Tibet became this. It was a place that the Western counterculture needed to exist, and therefore in their imaginations, it existed in the ways that they wanted it to exist. And then, of course, in the 20th century, by strange geopolitical coincidence, Tibet is shut right at the moment when Nepal is opened. And so all that freighting of romance that had been loaded onto Tibet gets shifted to Nepal, and Nepal becomes a kind of tourist Tibet. I can't tell you how many times people have described to me Nepal as a small Buddhist country. David's shaking his head. Yeah, I've heard that too. You know, where 90% of the people are Hindu. But it's the Nepal as small Buddhist country that attracts people, and largely because it's much more difficult to go to Tibet. But no, I mean there's no natural reason why mountains should be mystical, or why mountains should even be peripheral. A colleague of mine pointed out to me how the world's second largest mountain range, the Andes, there the civilization is along the spine of the Andes, and the magical peripheries are on either side. So it's not the mountains that are magical, it's it's somehow the mental maps that are constructed around civilizations. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions. So one is related, when you go to Kathmandu, don't you feel that maybe the part of mental construction that you are talking to, that there is has a basis in reality? Because when you go to Kathmandu and you see the way maybe Westerners imagine spirituality and mysticism in a very different way, where the way religion is practiced as part of everyday life in Kathmandu Valley, in public spaces, I mean, there is a certain degree that it might not be just a mental construction, that what, you know, that basically, don't you feel that there is an element of truth or reality, no, ontological reality, whatever you call it, to this mental? And the second one, when you talk about periphery, right? Himalayas is being of periphery. So if you talk to some dharma tourists, and I have talked to quite a bit, and I've read some of the bits, they talk about the Himalayas as being the heart. So if you look at the macrocosm and microcosm as the heart of the universe, no, and Mount Kailash as whatever. So it's precisely, it's not the periphery. So the way they relate this, and I'm not no expert, but I was just wondering, from your experience of going to Kathmandu, how do you relate to what's going on in all this myriad of temples, even in Tamil? So Tamil for a tourist, but then if your friend goes you and there are all these living shrines, not living, but shrines which are actively as part of the everyday morning puja. So what's your take on this?
It's a good point, but you know, as a kid, I spent a number of years in India growing up, and I don't see a lot of difference between daily religious practice in a mid-sized Indian town that I would in the Kathmandu Valley, which is not to say that it's the same, it's not. But the role of religion in everyday life, I don't think that Kathmandu is particularly exceptional. I think that what's exceptional is perhaps the diversity of practices, but not the place of it. So I think it's easy for Westerners to go there and imagine that this is something unique. But whether religion is any more of a crucial part of daily life there than in, Central Africa, I don't know. I doubt it. But your point about the periphery, I think all I would say, for better or worse, is that for the counterculture, the periphery becomes the center.
Yeah, I feel obliged to pick you up on that, on the last point about the rituals. As you know, a lot of my early work deeply invested in this idea that, I found it hard to put Madame Blavatsky's imaginings and the imaginings of Sylvain Lévy in the same box and say they're equally constructed and equally fallacious. I just can't accept that. And I think we can prove, we can show, and I'm very conscious of the charges of Orientalism and essentialism and romanticism, because that's our stock in trade as anthropologists, is not to fall for those things. But nonetheless, I think you can demonstrate that the particular forms of liturgy and the particular form, there are certain things. Obviously, one mustn't fall into a trap and say, look, it's a museum. We're walking into a living museum. You can see here exactly what India was like 1,000 years earlier. Obviously, it's not. But I think until 50 years ago, I think it was sufficiently similar, and we can demonstrate that there were liturgical continuities directly from 13th century, what is now Western Bangladesh and Eastern Bihar, and so on, and rituals that are still being done every day in Kathmandu, which are not being done in your average mid-sized, Madhya Pradesh Indian city. So I would push back on that. I'd also like to ask you about the kind of functionalist tone of your argument about the needs, so that the myth corresponds to the state needs. It's a kind of how does it exactly work that Yeti-hunting and fear of communism stops in 1960 because Mahendra has taken over? I don't think that's right, because I think the Americans remain very concerned about threats from communism right through the 60s and 70s, and in fact we know that the Russian and Chinese embassies were extremely active in pumping out, distributing, what the West saw as propaganda, what they saw as, correct proselytization on behalf of communism. So I don't think the Cold War stopped in 1960 just because Mahendra had taken over. And therefore I don't understand how the functionalist argument about the myths, why would the myths suddenly stop at that point and flip over?
Well, I mean, honestly, that is something that perplexes me too. Why is it that suddenly it's as though a light switch were flipped off and these Yeti hunts stop? And also, it's at the moment of Mahendra's coup that Nepal drops out of the headlines as a political actor. I can document this with charts.
But the Americans were just as concerned after 1960, so I can't disagree.
Yeah, but I think that after 1960, the U.S. treated or considered Mahendra's Nepal to be a kind of quasi-client state. He was a convenient democratic dictator along the lines of what they had installed in Iran and Indonesia and Egypt. And I think it was during that decade of democratic experiment that the West was, or at least the American political imagination was engaged with Nepal in ways that simply objectively seemed to disappear after 1960. And I still, and I can't explain it, why this coincidence of that Yeti hunting stops. And again,
there's the Chinese accusation that these were funded by the CIA.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it, and as you know, the Chinese put a stop to mountaineering for a period in the 60s. Again, because of charges of spying, and which are documented to have been true in some cases. But to get to your earlier point about Blavatsky and Sylvan Levi, no, I certainly don't want to put them in the same box. But I do think that Nepal, for both, served as this, well, what I called missing link. And whether you want to say that there's an objective basis to that or not, I still think that especially in the colonial period, Nepal was this place where one could imagine what India was before it was tainted by racial decline, Muslim invasion, these kinds of things. And so I think it had an interesting role within Orientalist knowledge production in that, to that extent. So yeah, I don't know if that...
Yeah, no, I mean, there is a serious historical sociological argument to be made, and Levy's namesake, Robert Levy, made that argument, quite explicitly in relation to Bhaktapur.
But in 1960, having studied British Foreign Office files during that period for the next 20 years, there was continuing concern from the Americans and the British that King Mahendra was getting too close to China. He was playing the China card, and endless amounts of money were poured in to try to persuade him not to put north, but to keep control. It never really fell off the radar, not at all. It was genuine concern. Continued.
Yes, and certainly Mahendra, he was a master. I mean, he turned, in effect, he turned the Cold War into a bidding war, and to prize to the highest bidder. So yeah, he was the master at playing off the sides, but at least in the way that Nepal figured into the popular imagination, it seems to have, it's almost, like I said, almost overnight, it switches from geopolitical actor to exotic wonderland in press coverage. And it disappeared, and it's very, you can look at catalogs of periodical literature, and you see how in the 50s, from around 1950 to 1960, there's heavy coverage of Nepal in news magazines. After 1960, it all shifts to lifestyle and adventure and tourist magazines. And it almost disappears from the news. And so yeah, it continues, Nepal continues to give, well, Mahendra continues to give his donor states anxiety, but that's part of, he was a master at that. He played it.
He succeeded.
Yes, he certainly did.
Sorry, time is over. So still we have reservation in the red line. So you all have joined to us and continue the debate or discussion in the pub. So thank you so much for making so wonderful talk.
Thank you.